Welcome to A Line Through Time, where I take the time to look through your favourite franchises and work out how it all lines up. Between 10 and 20 years ago, there was a certain trend with fighting games to produce an action-adventure spin-off game focused on a popular character from the series. Whether to flesh out the character's backstory or just to make some extra money on a mediocre adventure game, most of the biggest fighting franchises had at least one of these spin-offs. It's only slightly less ubiquitous than having 1 to 3 characters who are the only ones that are allowed to beat the final boss. Jeez man, like, get to the point already before I leave to watch, I don't know, Anita Sarkeesian or something. Well, hypothetical viewer, my point is that 1, you have terrible taste and I want you to leave, and 2, these adventure spin-offs had another certain tendency that is very relevant to the premise of this show. They are universally set early in the timeline, usually before or shortly after the first game, and they have an utterly unsettling amount of contradictory information within. With how far the series has usually come by then timeline-wise, these events are typically never alluded to again, leaving the subject of which set of information is accurate completely up for debate. So let's get into it with what I believe is the first instance of this, 1997's Mortal Kombat Mythology's Sub-Zero. As the name very subtly implies, this game is about Sub-Zero, specifically the original Sub-Zero from MK1. Given that he died in MK1, this is obviously a prequel. This one is probably the least egregious example I'll be discussing, however, since the story was written in conjunction with the same year's Mortal Kombat 4, sharing a number of characters, including the main antagonists. Mythology ties in directly to the motivations of MK4 Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Poor Man's Ocelot, leaving absolutely no room for debate as to whether or not the information in Mythologies is canonical. Sure, Sub-Zero is now invited to the tournament by Shang Tsung while he was originally sent there to assassinate Tsung, but this could simply be added context to explain how Sub-Zero gained access to the island, rather than a change in his motivation like MK2011 would later provide. But then it gets worse. 2000's Mortal Kombat Special Forces features Jax, a character best known for his big metal arms from MK3 onwards. However, he started out with normal arms in his debut in MK2. Special Forces is supposed to be set before MK1, but despite that, Jax still has the metal arms. Did he stop using them, then decide to start again later? Is this supposed to imply Jax always had the metal arms despite what MK2 showed? Of course we know now, thanks to subsequent stories set during that time frame, that yes, Jax did have normal arms during MK2, and the only acknowledgement of Special Forces since then is that Tremor really took off for some reason, and some of the other bosses feature in the MKX comic, even though Jax kills them in the game. Is Special Forces just not canon? Who knows? Now that seems bad, right? But the lack of evidence that Special Forces is at all canonical is actually an improvement over the next MK spin-off, Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks from 2005. Shaolin Monks is a co-op focused retelling of the end of MK1 and the events of MK2, starring the titular monks Liu Kang and Kung Lao. Most details about the original story were contradicted here. Instead of being tricked into thinking Shao Kahn is her father, Kitana is now under mind control. Instead of being presumed dead until MK4, Goro flees with the other villains and is known to still be alive until his death here. Instead of vowing to protect the younger Sub-Zero as penance for his actions, Scorpion just works for Shao Kahn. Instead of being a man who is willing to fake his own death to pursue a life of peace and who only gets involved in the conflicts out of a sense of duty, Kung Lao is now a hateful, envious, glory-seeking dirtbag who despises Liu Kang and has a purely one-sided rivalry with the man. The next game, Armageddon, acknowledges the alleged rivalry, suggesting Shaolin Monks have planted MK2 in canon, but in the altered timeline of MK2011, at a point where the timeline alteration is at an absolute minimum, Kitana is simply tricked like in MK2, Goro flees to Outworld like in Shaolin Monks, Scorpion is part of an entirely different faction, and Kung Lao's rivalry with his friend is much less vindictive. Basically, they just pick and choose random elements from either version, create entirely new ones, and make following this franchise's story more trouble than it's fucking worth. I just might have to do a video on all 3 versions of the story someday. Around the same time, Tekken received its own spin-off, Death by Degrees, starring series staple Nina Williams. Nina's primary story has always been her intense rivalry with her sister Anna, a rivalry that only grew more heated after their beloved father Richard died between the first 2 games, prompting both sisters to blame each other for his death. Death by Degrees, set sometime before Tekken 1, has a number of flashbacks to an incident during the sisters' childhood, where a group of soldiers trying to take Richard's daughters from him. After they take Anna away, Richard refuses to hand over Nina and is shot dead in front of Nina in the preceding scuffle. Anna then returns and comforts her sister, evidently not believing that Nina is in any way responsible, just as Nina cannot possibly blame Anna as she knows exactly how their father died. But Death by Degrees released in between Tekken 4 and 5 during Nina's amnesiac phase, and shortly before the two became heavily embroiled in the Mishima conflict, so the subject of their father's death hasn't been touched on since. Namco's other fighting series, Soul Calibur, has Soul Calibur Legends from 2007, shortly before Soul Calibur 4's release. Legends retells Soul Blade's climax before filling in the gap between Soul Blade and Soul Calibur. Originally, series protagonist Siegfried Storffen discovered the evil sword Soul Edge by the body of its dead host, Cervantes. The sword took control of Cervantes' body to fight Siegfried, who won despite his own blade being destroyed in the battle. He took up Soul Edge, which took control of him, and released the Evil Seed, which drives people into berserker rage and is very important to the backstory of Soul Calibur 1 co-protagonist Keelik. Legends instead has Siegfried find Soul Edge nowhere near Cervantes with no weapon of his own to defend himself prior to this. Cervantes reanimates under some unrelated power, and only after the fight does the Evil Seed get unleashed, creating skeletons and lizard men and fucking dragons, but not intense rage. The game then continues a year later where Siegfried is still not possessed yet. In the end, all the main characters conclude that both Soul Edge and Soul Calibur are evil. Siegfried discards Soul Edge in favour of a new sword, and then the credits suggest Siegfried takes up Soul Edge anyway in spite of everything because canon dictates he becomes Nightmare in preparation for Soul Calibur 1. Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball is a unique case as it's not an adventure game and it's definitely canonical as Zack's DOA 4 bio acknowledges it. Say what you will about Itagaki, but his spin-off was certainly different. But if Code Cronus had been made, that likely would have fit the criteria. And let's head some of you off at the pass before you make fools of yourselves in the comments. The Eternal Champion spin-offs are alternate continuity, so they don't count. Joke side games like Tekken Card Challenge and Super Puzzle Fighter also don't count because they're silly non-canon affairs. And two bits of trivia people will probably bring up if I don't. Shenmue was originally planned as a Virtua Fighter spin-off centered on main character Akira Yuki, which is always hilarious. A spin-off for the protagonist as if they need a story where they're the main character, away from the story where they're the main character. And the original sequel to Street Fighter was like this, but it was turned into its own IP as Final Fight because this was at a time when the people at Capcom actually cared what the fans thought and knew that a radically different new entry is best labelled a spin-off or turned into a new IP. These games are problematic for people like me, people who actually care about the story in fighting games, people who want to see a good, cohesive storyline with fun and compelling characters whose storylines we can track from beginning to end. But apparently story doesn't matter in fighting games. Fighting games can't have, don't deserve, or simply shouldn't have good stories. These are real things I've been told by people alleged to be human beings. There are actually real people who would honestly choose not to have a good story in the media they consume. I guess that explains the popularity of Injustice.
My nigga, you just got roasted! Yeah! You just got roasted, son.